Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session of our Agile testing and automation presentation. I hope everyone's feeling well and good and had a good start to the week. So previously, I always like to go back to the previous session and remind us of what we looked at. So previously, or the last session, we did an introduction to testing and the second part of it, and we did look at the value of testing, how much testing, test basis, and I want to remind us on that note that right from the beginning, we said the first early sessions will be based on, traditional software testing. It's just so that we lay some foundations for Agile, especially for those who do not understand a lot of things. So we're still on that journey. We'll probably continue that in the next couple of sessions, which will kind of lay the foundation for Agile testing. So we as I said, we did look at the value of testing in the previous session, how much testing and test basis. In this session, we're going to concentrate on, or we're going to start looking at fundamental test activities. Fundamental test activities. From day one, I did mention, or I did make clear that testing is not a lone activity. It is not a lone activity. It is a process which depends on other activities. So the plan in this session is to start looking at some of these testing activities, right? There are three main aspects of organizational test process. There are three very important aspects. The first one is test activities and tasks, which we will be looking at again in this session. The second one is test work products. Test work products. By test work products, we're referring to test bases, test conditions, and tests that provide coverage. Okay, so the second one is test work products, and the third one is traceability. Traceability between the test basis and work products. I want to, remember we looked at test basis in the last session. So if you weren't part of the last session, I encourage you to go and look at test basis. But traceability is important, and it's important is that the test basis. It's important that the test basis has measurable coverage defined, okay, or measurable coverage criteria defined. It is important that every test basis has measurable coverage criteria defined, and that is where traceability comes in. And this coverage then acts as KPIs or key performance indicators that drive the activities that demonstrate achievement of the testing objectives. And I will be looking at testing objectives shortly, but this is what testing is all about. There are these KPIs that need to be, looked into. There are these test coverage activities that we need to look into. Okay, talking about fundamental test activities. Again, there are a few activities that come in, and these activities also they are composed of other activities which we will be looking at. We'll start looking at in this session. The first one, of course, is planning, and then monitoring and control, test analysis, test design, implementation, test execution, and evaluating exit criteria and reporting, and then test closure activities, right? I want to mention or make clear here, usually whenever you talk about testing, people's mind goes to one thing: execution. Usually, whenever you talk about testing, people always think about execution. I think I'm missing one here: test closure activity. So these activities form the fundamental, or they are the fundamental test activities. But then, as I said, they have sub activities. They are composed of other activities. And I want to say this again, that usually when you talk about testing, people's mind goes straight to execution. But it will interest you to know that execution is just a small part of what testing does. We've got all these activities: planning, monitoring and control, analysis, test design, test implementation, execution, evaluating exit criteria, and reporting, and then test closure activities. These items that we've got here, or activities that I've listed here, are what we'll be looking at in this session and the probably next 2 sessions. I'm going to try and cram it into 2 sessions, but then it might spill into 3 sessions. But it's important that we look at these high-level activities. And 70% of testing activities, all of testing activities, are based on these: planning, monitoring and control, analysis, design, and implementation. I'll say that again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 70% of testing activities, or test effort, let me put it that way, testing effort goes into the first 5 that we've got here. It means that only 30% or less than 30% of testing activities or testing effort goes into execution. So if anyone thinks that testing is all about execution, execution is a very minor part of testing. Okay, let's go straight into planning. So in this session, we'll be looking at planning and monitoring and control. Well, first of all, let's look at planning. What is test planning? Or even before that, Benjamin Franklin, the image you're looking at here, is one of the founding fathers of the United States, and he quoted this statement. He said, "If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail." And this has always guided me in testing. And I suppose it applies to, almost any project or anything that we do. If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. So even in testing, planning is a very important part. It's a big part of testing. And test planning starts at the initiation of the testing process. Remember, again, that I said testing is not an activity, or it's not a lone activity, it's a process. And test planning starts at the very time the testing process is initiated. And it runs all the way through. It's an ongoing process. It runs all the way through till completion of activities. It means that if anything changes, if the organization's processes or certain things change, we go and adjust the test plan to suit, right? So if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right? Test planning, what exactly is it? Test planning refers to the planning activities that must be performed during testing in order to achieve the objectives, or to achieve test objectives. And it involves the needs for a system, analyzing the needs for a system in order to plan activities and work products that will achieve the test objectives. And as I said before, it's an ongoing activity, and it's initiated right at the beginning. Objectives, just to help us clarify, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. In case someone's wondering, what are test objectives? Quickly, I'm just going to run over this. You can see the first one here is test. One of the objectives of testing is to prevent defects. We did this at the early stages anyway, but just a recap. It's to prevent defects, evaluate work products. We also want to verify requirements. We want to validate test objectives. We want to build confidence in the product these are things that testing, these are the objectives of testing. We also want to reduce risk and share information to stakeholders. I've said this even in the previous session, that one of the important things for a test for testing to do is to always keep stakeholders updated about the status of the product. And then another objective is to find failure and defects, not for bad reasons, for good reasons, and also to prevent defects. So these are objectives. I'll share, you can see them in the slides later. It's not the main part of what we're doing, but this is what planning looks at. This is what we aim to achieve. Planning activities include analyzing the product. In other words, in planning stage, we list the features that are in scope and out of scope. We also design, at that stage, you want to design test strategies and test approach. Test strategies are documents that it's one of the testing documents. It's fed from the testing objectives, from the testing, what do you call it? It is fed from the test policy, test policy of the company. It kind of defines guidelines for the test approach to be followed in order to achieve the objectives. We also define testing goals and objectives at this stage. So we have overall testing objectives, but you want to define specific to the project or operation that you're working on. We also at this stage define test criteria, test suspension and resumption. So if anything happens and testing stops, let's just say there's a showstopper which stops the testing activities, you want to actually define in planning stage what testing is supposed to do. And when testing resumes again, you want to define which steps to take. At this stage as well, we also identify and plan resources. Who's testing? What caliber of testers do you need? Do you need automation testers, just manual testers? Are you going to involve test managers? Who are the key, the key type of testing resources that you need? You identify them here. You also plan test schedule and estimation. When do you want to start testing? At what stage? And then you also define how estimation will be done. Identify methods for collecting and tracking test metrics, and I'll touch on test metrics a bit later. But yeah, we also identify all these as part of test planning. And then external dependencies, we identify them as well, and associated SLAs. Sometimes you work with other people in the other departments. We sometimes work with outsource third-party developers, third-party testers, etc. You define the relationship that we have here. Test planning stage, again, we also define as how we want the test environment to be set up, depending on the nature of the product, and we select the tools. What tools are you going to be using for different kinds of things? We select them at this stage. And finally, well, it's probably not the last, and there are other activities, but the last one that I've got here is we define risks. We determine and define risks. So these are activities in planning alone, in test planning alone. This test planning results in production of some deliverables. Okay, the first one I'll give you two of them. The master test plan, and which is a document that you deliver, and then the phased test plan. So the difference between these two documents is that the master test plan typically addresses multiple test levels. By test levels, I'm talking about like unit testing, integration testing. When you bring all of that, this is the high level document which addresses all of them and has everything in it. But then within, let's just say sprints, when you're working on small projects or at lower level, we have the phased test plan as well. This typically addresses test phases. Let's just say if you're working within a sprint, each sprint you want to produce a phased test plan. Okay, so that's it for test planning. I'm going to move on swiftly and quickly to test monitoring and control. Test monitoring involves tracking of ongoing progress of test work products and resources against planned progress using any test monitoring metrics defined in the test plan. So remember I said earlier on that we define monitoring metrics. We define some metrics in the test plan. So this simply evaluates and provides feedback on ongoing currently in progress testing phase. Here in progress, it just feeds back. It evaluates and provides feedback to the team. I'm sorry, to stakeholders. Okay. Again, examples of test metrics. I want to clarify in case somebody's wondering what metrics are. Metrics just help in measuring the current state of an activity or progress, or it helps to set benchmarks and targets. And examples of these in testing include, examples are defect metrics, okay, defect metrics, test coverage metrics. I'll show you an example in a minute. We've also got test execution metrics. We've got design metrics and test closure metrics and test control activities. Okay, as I said again, I'll show you an example in a minute. As I said again, metrics are defined by the testing team, but in association or agreed with the agreed with all stakeholders. Okay, agreed with you work on this with stakeholders in the test planning stage. I've got an example of the metrics here. You can see this graph. I've got two examples to show you. We've got test execution progress metrics here. You can see new test cases. You can see all the on the left hand side, the y-axis. You can see the expected levels of test cases, and then you can also see in the y-axis the period of time that we're doing the testing. And clearly the new test cases, you can see new test cases and then existing test cases. You can also see the failed and passed tests, all in this test execution or testing execution progress matrix. And this is important for monitoring and measuring because it helps stakeholders to evaluate the quality of the current product, and it also helps to improve the quality of the product or the process itself, and it helps to apply control measures during development stage. I've got another in the last, probably the last one here, the last example here to show to you. This shows defect trends. This is another metric. So you can clearly see the trend of open defects there. We've also could see actual defects that were raised and closed on this matrix. So just to end it, test control guides the testing to fulfill the mission or the strategies end objectives. It is simply an activity of guiding and taking corrective measures based on the metrics and information in order to improve efficiency and quality. And this actually includes revisiting the test planning activities as needed. Well, this brings me to the end of today's session on planning, monitoring, and control of testing. Thank you very much. And on that note, I think I might as well mention the next session we'll be talking about. We'll continue with the other activities and talk about test analysis, test design, and then test implementation. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to you guys and allow some questions and feedback. I've seen one here. What tools are used in testing? From Demola. Testing tools. There's so many testing tools depending on what you're doing, but basically you're thinking of the tools you use in writing your test cases and logging these test cases or storing test cases. You can also talk about if automation will be involved. You want to think about all these tools and then mention them in the planning stage. So it just depends on what the specific project requires.
Hi, Eric.
Hello.
Yeah, I know. Can we go back to the stage where you talked about all the planning activities that we have to look at instead of always thinking about execution? Because that was a very interesting page for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's the one yeah. Okay.
So all these stages are involved in testing. So if I look at it, from what I have seen most test teams do is they've used Excel spreadsheets to organize all the documents and then use tools like Selenium and various others. So who's preparing the test plan and all the documents? Is it the tester or?
Very good question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, good question. Thanks for that. So most of these are management activities. However, if let's say you're the only test analyst on board and there's no manager, you will need to do all these. This is why I believe testing is undermined and testing is not allowed to do their work properly. One of the recent projects that I worked on, I started as the main test analyst on that specific project and had to do everything as part of the whole project. So it depends on where you are, and the test manager when auditing will be looking at all these things to see whether use stuff like monitoring and control to monitor your progress and audit other test analysts or audit your work as well. But yes, these are all expected to be used. Yeah. So these basically manage test execution or the whole testing process. And the more, obviously, with anything, the more you use or apply. If you do good planning, monitoring, analysis, good design, good implementation, in my opinion, it saves you a lot of hassle when it comes to execution. Because by the time you get to execution, you've eliminated a lot of risks, a lot of potential issues. But if you wait till execution and then what are you going to use? you need to design test cases anyway. So you need to, before you design test cases, you need to analyze it. We'll go into all these in the next sprint, but you need to do all these preps before getting to execution stage. And of course, when you finish execution, when finish execution, there are all these other evaluating and all these things that need to be done. So I think this is useful for everyone here because when you're working with test analysts, you need to really be asking questions about whether they're doing these things.
Hi, Eric.
Hey, I'm not sure who's.
So if I document, I know Agile moves away from documentation, but in medical environments, documentation is always important. What are some of the documentations we should expect? Is it only the test? Should there be a Gantt chart? Should there be a test roadmap? What are some of the things we should expect as part of planning?
Well, as part of planning, yes, you could. So that comes into, you can expect Gantt charts, but I think Agile is moving, not using a lot of Gantt charts these days. There are metrics that you mentioned earlier. There's test execution, test planning. There are test planning matrices. Where are some of the matrices that I mentioned here? There are all these defect matrices, test coverage metrics, test execution, and many more. So you, in your test plan, define and agree with test stakeholders which of these matrices you want to be using or you will be using. Which stakeholders will hold you accountable for them. So project manager will look at this and say, right, I want to see your, say, test design metrics, or I want to see your test coverage metrics, so we know how much you've covered in this, based on the test basis. Okay.
Thank you, Eric.
Hey, hi, Eric.
Hey, OM.
Yeah, how's it going, man?
Yeah, good, man. Good to hear your voice.
Yeah, man. Thanks for the session. Just a quick one, man. It's not a long one, I'm thinking of, when a testing is being done at any point in time, it's always benchmarked against something.
Yes, sir.
Because when a solution is provided or is being built, it's according to specification that was spelled out. So the testing is against that specification. Is it going to meet that requirement or not? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Now, if there is a defect, a fault, whatever,
yeah.
So that means that it goes back to the developing team now, the developers now, to fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. And then at what stage does the BA really come in up? Because again, the BA is watching the requirements because the stakeholders had said, okay, this is what we wanted. And the BA had actually written a requirement and all. So to see whether it meets with that requirement, at what point in time does that happen?
Well, I think that will be, remember when you look at these test activities, I don't know whether you can see this now.
I can see it.
There's all this evaluating test exit criteria and reporting. There's the reporting stage, okay, which we will be touching later and drilling into. And then there's the test closure activity stage. Aside to that, of course, you can always depend on traceability. Traceability is, you can always depend on traceability, where you look at different matrices to see where we are, how much have we covered. If the test coverage matrix shows that you've covered every test cases, then it means that the testers probably, done everything. Then you go to look at your traceability metrics and trace them back to the test basis. Okay, you can trace your let's just say you've got test cases, you trace it back to the test conditions, and then trace test conditions back to the requirements, for instance. requirement document. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I'm trying to
Yeah.
understand.
So if there's anything missing, you can always do a traceability, requirement traceability. Use your requirement traceability metrics to trace back to the requirement to make sure that everything's been covered.
Who owns this document, this traceability document?
The metrics is, I think testing defines it. So if you go back in test planning, I think we said here that we identify methods for collecting and tracing test metrics. So the test, you define all these at this stage, test planning, and it's kind of like owned by the testing team, but the project manager will be interested in it. Different stakeholders will be interested in it. But you tester, you define it. Ideally, you should be working with stakeholders to define this. So if I was working in testing, I'll define it and say, these are my matrices. The project manager will have to sign off my test plan anyway, or somebody, test manager, will have to sign it off anyway and say, no, we want more from you than this.
So it's the tester who develops the document, who generates the document?
Yeah, I'd say so, yes. Because this test plan is your contract with the business or with the project.
Right.
Yeah, so your test plan is like a contract. This is what I've got to offer you. Or as a test manager, you're saying, this is what we've got, testing has got to offer you. And and from this document, you should be providing us with good environments and all that. And if I was working in testing, depending on Agile or wherever, I would make this document. This document has to be part of my test entry criteria. If this is not ready, that depends on the company's policy. If the organization's policy says that test plan is an entry criteria for any testing activity, then it has to be ready and signed off before testing activities begin.
Mm-hmm.
Before execution begins.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. The last one is just how can we make the testing environment as close to life as possible?
So testing involves or works with the architects, technical architects. Again, in the test planning stage, you have to it comes under the external dependencies and associated SLAs being defined. Yeah, you see that coming from the bottom is the fourth thing. So in test planning stage, I will define all the dependencies, the departments that I'll have to work with. All these guys, I'll bring them here. But yeah, you define all these. And I will mention the architects here. And you work together with them to set up the environment, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, Eric.
No problem. I guess that's where DevOps comes in.
So, Eric.
Yes, sir.
How is the product owner involved in testing activities?
So this test plan document, the master test plan, when you look at when it's produced, the product owner will want to look, he will be interested in, how do I go back? He'll be interested in, they usually sign this off as well anyway. So they will look at it and see whether the top one, analyze how you've analyzed the product, the listing of the features, what's in scope and not in scope. The product owner will be very interested in that section of it. So this test plan document, as I said, is your contract with the whole project. And there will be different stakeholders interested in this document. And definitely the product owner will want to look at the features that are in scope and out of scope they may be interested in, your test strategy, the approach, and they may be interested in the test criteria, resumption, and, suspension. They may be interested in the risk session. A few things here that they will be interested in. And they will definitely feed into it.
You've got a question in the question area. What will be monitored at the monitoring and control stage? Why does the monitoring take place earlier before the execution?
Yeah, monitoring, I think we mentioned earlier on, monitoring is an ongoing. It's a currently in progress activity. So you define the metrics in test planning stage, and we monitor, we track the progress against whatever's defined planning. But it's an ongoing. Yep. Why does monitoring take place earlier? No, monitoring is it's an ongoing activity, but you define the metrics in test planning. Yeah. So if you look at the definition, it says test monitoring involves tracking of ongoing progress. It's an ongoing activity. Any more? See if there's any other question. Yeah, so in the absence of any other question, please feel free, if you've got more questions, put it on the platform, and I'll get back to you on it. But other than that, I think that brings me to the end, to be fair. And next week, we'll be looking at test analysis, test design, and then test implementation. And I want to remind us that these are just foundations for the agile testing and automation, because we will be mentioning some of these things there. We need to know these before we move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
Like a bird on a tree, I'm just sitting here. I got time.